became the term, the way it is used today is not what it was in the beginning, and it was repurposing. And so you have this, to her point about credibility is at an all-time low. And I think the last 4 years has done the industry no favors. I think there have been a system of incentives for people to behave poorly. I think two of the most disturbing things that happened, in my opinion, of happened in the industry is the overabundance of the sort of total reliance on anonymous sources, people given a free hand to quote anyone saying anything, and often, sometimes it actually did produce honest to God fake news. Two big examples. In very early days of the Trump administration, the Washington Post reported that the entire senior staff of the State Department had resigned en masse in protest of Trump. That wasn't true. That never happened. That never was going to happen. And the Washington Post kind of moved on. Like, well, that was a mistake, right? Well, who told you that? Where did you get that information? What systems did this go through? How did they get published? And then there was never, none of those questions were asked. None of them were explained. And you had another one. CNN actually had an incident where they had an anonymous source, and NBC claimed they had a separate anonymous source, and they both reported very false story. They claimed the Trump administration was given access to the hacked emails from Podesta and other DNC officials. They were given access prior to the general release online by the Russians. Never happened. If that happened, that's a huge, I mean, that's multiple crimes rolled into one. If Russian state operatives actually gave the GOP campaign access to these hacked emails, the Trump campaign got access to it like everybody else did when they got published online.
Do you want to explain who Podesta is?
Tony Podesta was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, for anyone who doesn't remember. His email was hacked because, if I'm not mistaken, his password was actually password123. So he was actually fairly simple to hack. But so all their stuff was published online. The bigger point of it, I don't want to do the TikTok of all the stuff that happened in 2016. The point is that CNN claimed that they had been given access by the Russians. Didn't happen. They're an anonymous source. Who knows? Who told them that? No idea. It was wrong. The story was retracted. NBC also reported the exact same thing, claiming they had a separate source, also anonymous. They ended up retracting. So you just had these sort of incidents going on constantly. And at the same time, you had a president who himself was incentivized to undercut everyone who was reporting something unflattering about him. And these were like little gifts being handed to him every time to be like, see what I'm saying? You can't trust them. Nobody can trust them. And so you had the system where instead of, the industry sort of working overtime to reestablish its credibility, which, by the way, was already in the tank well before Trump came along. Trump's anti-media attacks exist precisely because he knew it would work. His going into those rooms and those rallies and railing against the media is no more intelligent or clever than me walking to a room filled with children and saying ice cream is great. Because everyone will look around and go, yeah, ice cream's really great. I mean, he knew that people like this stuff. Like, people have a beef with the industry. He played that up, and instead, for the last 4 years, instead of the industry sort of taking the challenge, and I'll wrap up with this so I don't talk too much. Instead of sort of taking the challenge and working to reestablish credibility, you just had incident after incident. You had the White House press briefing. I won't even go into it. It was an excuse for people to showboat for the cameras. Book deals, contributor gigs. Everyone did really well in the last 4 years, except for the actual industry itself.
So I want to talk a little bit about how some of the factors that have led to the media industry really losing credibility, and maybe why that's happened. I don't think it's just perception. I think some of it is there's an increased pressure on reporters, on newsrooms, to produce at a much higher level than at any other point in time in history. Like the news cycle has become 24/7, which is really not good for people in the industry. Andrew Sullivan has talked about that, like the impact that that's had on him. And he's kind of an example of the most successful you can be as a digital media personality. Like, he was one of the first people, if not the first person, to leap from an established media outlet to being a brand himself, and having that be profitable. And then seeing what that did to him, having to get up every single day and just the relentless pace that is required. The sort of like the content machine, like outlets have to constantly churn out content, because profitability shifted from the dead tree, from newspapers that were sustained by the classified section. So with the rise of the digital age, local businesses don't need to take out, expensive ads telling people about their dry cleaning or whatever the case may be, hardware store in the community. I mean, same with grocery stores and coupons. Everything got moved to online, and the pricing for online is a fraction of what people used to pay to get into the newspaper for whatever reason that they might want to do that. And so the profitability model changed. So you've seen just tremendous upheaval in the industry in terms of being able to sustain itself, what actually produces income, number of clicks, that type of thing. And then at the same time, because the profit margins narrowed so drastically, because established media outlets had a really hard time pivoting to figure out how to produce media in a digital age, while at the same time there's some really interesting case studies of outlets that started out as nothing, right? Like Politico, for example, really have figured out, or Axios, which is some of the same people, figured out, okay, if you start out from you don't have like all this baggage, all of this infrastructure, all of these institutional assumptions and ways we've always done things, like we have to get this physical copy to the art peoples who can physically draw an artwork, and then that gets turned into an electronic product. Like the electronic piece came last, and so outlets that started out being digital first really had more of an advantage over legacy media who really did have to pivot, and struggled. And you may recall, I mean, depending on how old you are and how historically aware you are, you may recall just different experiments that outlets were making with profitability. Like, well, let's have a paywall. Well, people can get news from some other place. We're not as important as we thought we were. And then depending on what brand they are. So Wall Street Journal, it's one of the few that could actually sustain a paywall and be profitable that way because of its, I'd say, the fact that, its stranglehold on Wall Street news. Yeah. And their product was unique enough. It wasn't just sort of run-of-the-mill news. It was the niche and paid for by the deepest pockets in America on Wall Street. But then the other thing that really attacked credibility, I think, is that, as I was saying, as profit margins narrowed, the requirements to work at a newspaper really declined. So a lot of people right out of college who don't really know a whole lot would be the ones who are willing to work for the lower wages that newspapers and media outlets can offer. So they may not know much, but they're willing to churn out posts. And so you see a lot more mistakes. You see, and we saw this even with Trump coming into the White House, people saying this is unprecedented, because this really is the first administration that they had experienced as an adult in professional life, particularly, like, let alone in the media. So they had no clue, no context for what is normal for a new president coming in terms of executive orders that are being issued, or the first 100 days and what that says about a policy agenda. And there's not a lot of accountability for the lack of experience. And I'd say that's something that you deal with on a daily basis, the frustration of seeing, honestly, people who don't really know very much being elevated to positions of authority, and then there's not really a good mechanism. Like what used to be the letter to the editor that the community could use to say, hey, you got this wrong, and maybe the paper would issue a correction. There's not really a good accountability mechanism in the digital age when there's such a deluge of content and people are already on to the next story.
Right. I think a lot of times, I mean, the issue of bias or credibility media is a very large one. And for some people, I think it's very easy to just say it's political bias. It's their guy that they want to support. There's a confluence of a lot of events that I believe sort of contribute to the credibility issue, which has been, again, in the tank for a long time. And it's in the tank is probably not the best turn of phrase to use when I'm trying to get away from political bias. It's been rock bottom for a while, and it's been struggling to get away from that. One, of course, being the digital era has been a difficult adjustment for a lot of newsrooms. Another, so my experience when I first came in, I was expected to write 6 stories a day. And that was a constant sort of back and forth with editors, because how can you produce anything of any worth or any quality or in-depth reporting when you're expected to do 6 a day? I mean, at that point, you're just aggregating. You're just doing these little. They kept saying, this editor whose name shall not be mentioned kept referring to us as short order cooks. I was like, that's not how you do good journalism. Like, I can't get people on the phone. I can't get original quotes. I can't investigate anything. I'm looking at other people's investigative work and then finding a way to sort of aggregate that, and that's just interesting. And so you have that issue. You have social media has been a huge problem all on its own with,
sorry, 1 second. Sorry, my computer's synced. And yes, you warned me that might happen. I don't know how to unsync my phone from the computer for these
Oh,
purposes.
don't worry. Believe me, we've heard much worse. So don't.
Oh.
So then you have social media was a big problem as well. Facebook got in and everybody's head there needed to be a pivot to video. If you recall that, when a bunch of newsrooms lay off a lot of staff and then hired a lot of audiovisual people, and then it turned out, and then Facebook, I don't know if anyone remembers this,
Change their formula.
well, not just change their formula. They had a statement a few years later saying,
got it
well,
wrong.
actually, we got it wrong. We were reading the data wrong. The pivot to video wasn't such a good idea. And so you had all these newsrooms that just fired a whole bunch of people and hired a whole bunch of people to start doing these
Videos.
I'm sure you guys have seen this. You click on an article and it's not actually an article. It's just a stupid video, which nobody likes. I can't imagine why anyone ever thought that was a good idea. You have that issue. So you have this sort of like this rush to constantly meet the content demands. And that takes away from the ability to sort of put in the time, work, and effort to make good, credible journalism. So it's not across the board, of course, but then there's the other issue as well, which is for all we say about journalism and how important it is, and it is important, but it is also a business. There's a budget to maintain. And it turns out it's a lot easier to hire a bunch of young kids right out of college than maintain the old veterans who want to be paid like old veterans. And unfortunately, it turns out those old veterans actually know a lot more about, say, the general rules in the speaker's lobby than, say, the 21-year-old kid with a BA in English. And then
That was me.
I said, well, and so this is the, hi. So that's the case. I see this all the time. You see something said by someone who's an accredited journalist with a major outlet, and he's like, that's just not true at all. And then kind of sarcastically, is this your first time in oh, it is your first time in speaker's lobby. Okay. Then you feel kind of bad, but you have this issue. So it's again.
Well, wasn't there somebody who mistook some symbol for a Nazi symbol?
Yeah, they said the speaker, the house, it's not the gavel, what do you call it? The mace, the house mace, what is that called?
I don't know.
There's a technical term, it's got the American eagle, the bald, can go into the whole thing. There's the bald eagle is the American eagle. The brown eagle is the one that the Romans and the Nazis use. And a bunch of 20-year-old kids see the eagle in the speaker's office and they see all the sort of avian iconography all over the Capitol. And they're like, my God, this looks like Nazi Germany. It's like, well, first of all, we were around before Nazi Germany. These symbols had been around well before Nazi Germany. And I can't believe I have to have this discussion with people who cover the Capitol for a living. So I'll stop right there. But that's, yeah. So it's a lot of confluence events. It's way too easy to just say it's politics. Reporters just want to support their guy and they just want to hurt the other guy. It's a lot bigger than that.
I would also say many reporters are actually completely unaware of their bias. And some of that is a function of them not really knowing other people who believe differently or think differently than they do. I mean, we even see this with, the most recent election results with Trump and Biden being so close with the margins, the vote margins. And David Brooks, who we actually know, was in the New York Times saying this just shows that we need to do more to make sure we know people who would actually vote for Trump, which is what he said when Trump was first elected. So what's happened in the last 4 years? Like you still feel like you don't know anyone to describe what you would think of as this inexplicable phenomenon. And yet that is the reality of where the country is right now.
I want to come back to that in a minute. Could you both talk about how you got into the profession in the first place?
Yeah.
You want to go first?
Sure. So my getting into journalism was it was a happy accident. I guess you could say it was providential, really. I worked in the Bush White House, and the head of the speechwriting shop had worked at the Wall Street Journal, and one of the other speechwriters had also worked at the Wall Street Journal. And it was very interesting to me to hear them talk about their experiences. And then after their terms there, they ended up going back to newspapers. I had moved to the Department of Health and Human Services, a sub-agency called the Administration for Children and Families. I was in the press shop and I was doing some speech writing for the deputy secretary there. And while I was there, I knew, okay, we've got like 9 months left in the administration. And I was like, there's gonna be a lot of people looking for jobs here pretty soon, and I'm gonna be one of them. So before my time was up there, a publishing house, Regnery Publishing, offered me a job. They needed a senior editor to do books, and a friend from speechwriting connected me, sent my resume in, and I interviewed, and I ended up deciding to take the job. And I was a book editor there for nearly 3 years, close to 3 years. Didn't love editing books. Of all the editing gigs I've had, this is probably my least favorite in terms of format for written words and that type of thing. But then I was looking for another job, and the editorial page editor at the Washington Times was looking for an assistant editorial page editor, and my boss at Bregnery knew that I was looking to do something else and connected me. And coincidentally, the editorial page editor was a guy who was friends with both of the people I'd worked with at the White House who'd worked at the Wall Street Journal, because he had also been at the Wall Street Journal. And so I happened to meet him at the wedding of the colleague who'd been in speechwriting years ago. And we didn't realize that until, I'm having the interview and I'm like, wait a minute, you look familiar. Oh, that's right. Yeah, wait. I think you did something embarrassing that night, but I didn't say that. I was just like, oh, I remember you. So, long story short, he hired me. I was at the paper for a couple years, and that was how I got into journalism. That's how I learned to write an editorial. That's how I ended up running the op-ed pages, and then transitioned out of that.
It's not nearly as fun. I graduated in 2008 at the height of the financial crash. So I would have basically taken a job anywhere. If someone offered me a gig on an oil rig, I would have taken it. Work was hard to come by for anyone coming right out of college, but it just so happened I had some academic background in business and finance, and a startup needed a finance and business editor, and a friend knew someone, and they just recommended my name. I interviewed the guy and I got the gig. It's about as simple as that. Not really glamorous. And it turned out I was really good at it because I knew how to write and I understood the subject, and I just kind of felt like being tossed in the deep end. Just figure it out, sink or swim, and I did well with it. I actually really enjoyed business reporting. The problem is that nobody reads business reporting, so it's a very lonely beat. And then sort of branched out from there and started doing a lot more political writing, political news reporting, which is an area I've always enjoyed. And then eventually, several years into that, they moved me into commentary because they thought I had opinions that were worth sharing. And I've been doing that ever since. The 2016 election is the last time I've done actual news reporting. Since then, it's all been op-ed and commentary.
Yeah, you were in the Hillary campaign.
I was in bed with the Clinton campaign, which was funny because that nobody else was covering it. Everybody else was assigned to cover the Trump campaign because, the guy says at least 10 newsworthy things in a setting, not just in a day, in a setting. So in 2016, they're like, we need everyone covering whatever is going on with this thing over here. Oh, and yeah, I suppose we need someone on the Democrat.
I'm going to push back on you a little bit and say that, in my opinion, the fact that in most media outlets' estimations that it should take 5 reporters on Trump for every 1 reporter on Hillary is a reflection of the belief that was common that Hillary just isn't going to be saying anything newsworthy. There's not a lot of vetting we need to do here. She's clearly qualified. Like, it's sort of the fix was in for Hillary as far as the industry is concerned, except for conservative media.
Well, I don't know if it was like, oh, she won't say anything news, or they definitely said newsworthy things. Is that
they're not going to report it.
Well, no, I did.
You did. I did. Right, but you're in conservative media. Like, that's what I'm saying.
No, but there were a lot of people following around. She said the Clinton machine is like any professional political campaign. They're very sort of, they say a lot without saying a lot. And it's hard to wring a good lead or a good headline out of it. Where you can't deny it, Trump literally made headline. Everything you say, you're like, my God, I can't believe you just said that. Yeah. Like every sentence out of his mouth was its own headline. Whereas Clinton would say something like, you'll ask her about some crisis and she'll say something like, we'll look into that. Like, that's not a headline. You can't. And so this actually goes back to the bigger issue about the sort of melding of entertainment with news, which news has always had an element of entertainment. And anyone who tells you otherwise is not being honest. The old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. There's always been an element to it because it is a business. We can't ignore that it is a business with a budget and a bottom line. But I would say in the last at least 10 years, maybe with the rise of cable news or social media or whatever, there's just been such a marriage of entertainment. Watching CNN is like watching WWE. You have the goons, you have the good guys. Everyone has sort of a background character, and they all sort of act like it. And you're watching like, I'm not watching a news station. This isn't like C-SPAN.
Well,
this is,
and they're not very informed.
No,
that's the other dirty secret. Most of the people who come on those shows, like they have. If they're hired by the network, most of them will come in with the talking points the producers gave them, and that's all they talk about. They don't research the topics independently. And actually, Becket was a regular on a show that was on, what was that?
It was on HLN, which is the subsidiary of
CNN. And they kept having him back because he'd actually come in having researched the topics, and he'd have fresh original takes on things, and everyone else was there with their little like, oh well, this is not, where'd you get that bullet point, you know?
I know, it was one of those weird moments when you're coming up in the industry. It sort of like kind of makes you feel like a sap. Where like the first time I was brought on, I had these stacks of like I was doing homework. I'm like, I got to prepare for this. I'm going to be on camera. People are going to see this. I'm all nervous, and I got all this homework, all this stuff, and I go into the green room, and it's just chilling. They have 3 points that they've remembered, and that was it. And one of them was like, I didn't even read the assignment or something. I'm like, kind of like hiding the homework. Like, yeah, I didn't read anything either. And this is so silly, you know. You go, and it turns out none of these people do any of the background. They like get a general idea, and they show up on camera, and they're very informative. And I'm sure if you've ever watched cable news, self-assured, like you just project. But I'm sure if any of you have watched cable news, you've seen it before, where you'll see this sort of intense debate, and a very specific pointed question will be asked. And the person will go, that's a great idea, but what I really want to talk about, and then they just go right back to it, because they do that because they have no idea how to answer, and they just stick to the talking point. So once you see it on the inside, you're like, okay, I can understand why none of you guys sound like you know what you're talking about. This is fun. But
probably let them ask questions.
Oh yeah, I'll shut up.
I'm old enough to remember. I mean, I was in TV newsrooms before social media, and I'm even before that. You could, if you watched the network news on a typical night, you know, and way back when you only had 3 choices:
right.
NBC, CBS, ABC. And I can remember, you know, as a kid, watching those, and you know, if you were able to watch them at the same time, which I didn't, but I think if you were able to, you'd get basically the same information and the same stories, and they would lead with the same things. If we went on right now, if we were able to compare side by side Fox News's website and CNN's website, it would look like they're covering different countries.
Yes.
And they don't even pretend to try to find some sort of middle ground. And I guess this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, but how do we as consumers trust the information that we're receiving? How do we have to be part of the vetting process. So how do we do that?
It's funny you ask that. That is literally the number one question I'm asked by everyone in my family, friends, basically anyone who finds out I'm in any way related to working in the news industry, asks me, who do I trust? How do I know how to do this? That seems to me to be a huge gap that I don't know if anyone has answered it or knows how to answer it. All I can recommend is not just using personal discernment, but like just little rules. Like if this confirms your priors, it's probably you need to double check it.
Prior expectations.
Yeah, it confirms any of that. If it's something that seems too good to believe, find a secondary source. Like if CNN is reporting something exclusive that sounds amazing, you get shocked, get amazed, get whatever, but also maybe keep it to yourself until a competing newsroom is able to also validate that through their own sources.
If you have an immediate strong emotional reaction, you should probably like look at another secondary, not in the same ideological space source.
And it doesn't seem realistic, but what I increasingly do, if I see a quote or someone said something, I would really like to see it or hear it myself, because I don't trust paraphrasing. I don't trust notes at this point, and it's not left or right. At this point, it's just so many people are either, again, incentivized to produce quickly instead of diligently, or some people have perhaps their own agenda that they want to do. But if it's a quote, try to find an original source. See if you can find it on C-SPAN. See if you can find the original speech where they said this thing and try to get it.
What's the context?
That's the other thing too. You got to get the full context. Whenever I do a report on something someone said, and I want to get to, this is a thing they said that is dramatic or scandalous or whatever, I make sure I provide at least the first 3 and the last 3 paragraphs almost as much as I can, because you want to give them the full surrounding context. It's really easy to cherry pick little things, and if you present them without context, it looks damning. But it's difficult. Like, how do you tell someone like, well, okay, always read this person, always read, you can't really do that anymore.
I would say
there's some sources that are better than others.
Yeah. I would say RealClearPolitics is good because it aggregates. And I know the people, I mean, not just because I, write for them, although not very often these days, but I know the people who founded it, they lean conservative, but they want to present all sides of an argument. They want to make sure they capture what people are thinking about and talking about, whether it's on the left or on the right. And then they just put them as a list of links that you can look at. I mean, I can just kind of see where people are coming from across the ideological spectrum just by reading the headlines of the pieces that they've picked as relevant. And then if there's a particular topic you're trying to drill down into, yeah, look at a couple different treatments of it. I mean, look at a place that's explicitly left and a place that's explicitly right. And you'll often learn pieces of the story that one or the other didn't ultimately report, including important things like historical background.
Part of the credibility you guys have mentioned earlier, this relatively recent phenomenon of using anonymous sources as just basically an everyday practice. I think it's fair to say it used to be that anonymous sources were used sparingly, and now, I mean, virtually every day somebody's using or citing anonymous sources to verify some report. Where has the line gone that at one point would have led an editor to say, wait a minute, we've got to have somebody on the record here, to the point where we are now? Well, anonymous sources, okay, let's go with it.
Well, a couple of points on that. First, I think the most distressing thing is I don't think it's going to go back, because if I'm a government official with an axe to grind or something, why would I ever go on the record again? Because now you can talk all the trash you want, you can reveal any little tidbit that sounds damning you want, and say, yeah, no, I don't use my name, and I know you'll publish it because you've done it before. I think that's, for me, is the most distressing thing. I don't know how we go back to not doing that. But to your point about how that happened, I think, again, it's the allure of, oh, we can be the first to get this story. They won't go on the record, but it's such a good story. And I do think we
need content.
And we need content. We want to be the first to the story. If we wait, maybe the Washington Post or the Daily Beast will get confirmation before us, and then we'll lose out on that. The other thing too is I do think there is a sort of moral thinking put in the mix, which is a lot of reporters. And I think to your question, like, how did the editors not look at this? I think a lot of editors did look at it and go, well, you know what? These are unprecedented times.
And it sounds true.
It sounds true. Are you sure your sources? I mean, I can't speculate on what the newsroom conversations were, but I can theorize based on what some of these editors have said in public and what their editors have said in public and what the reporters have, which is this: these are unprecedented times. They call for unprecedented measures. So the old sort of rules that were never really rules, or more like guidelines, they can be suspended right now. And my problem with that, obviously, is what I led with is, well, once you suspend them, it's going to be really hard to put them back. Because what government official will ever go on the record again, and why?
I don't have anything to add to that. I agree.
Was there a time? Was this a social media phenomenon where you think that things went kind of sideways with the emphasis on getting stuff out, producing more content quickly, so then standards were just sort of set aside?
Well, I wouldn't say it's just social media. I'd say that it was really like the shift in profitability for the industry, right? And so when you saw like waves and waves of layoffs, multiple layoffs, and they were getting rid of the older, seasoned, expensive people, right? If you've got to cut your budget and you can lose one person who's the older, like, seasoned editor for this amount of money, or you can lose 3 junior people with 3 people's worth of output, then you're going to go with the one seasoned person. And so you see a degrading. I mean, there is a lot to be said for experience. I think particularly in the media industry, and I mean, you could even maybe speculate a little bit about what's the educational background of the people who do come into the media. Are they people who received a comprehensive education, right? Was there an emphasis on history, and even recent history, and not just kind of a repeating of certain assumptions about historical events, right? Like, just anytime that there's just one way to see something is where I think a lot of bias can creep in. And I think that in the media industry, there really has been a move towards the belief that there's only one way to see something, and it's the way that the outlet is reporting it, it tends to be much more liberal, much more left leaning. And I think what is alarming to me is that if there's just that, if you don't agree with the one way of seeing it, I think that we're really seeing these days a certain morality is being imbued with disagreeing with it, right? So it's not that I disagree with this viewpoint, it's you're a bad person if you don't agree with this way of looking at it and this way of reporting on this topic. And there's no other side on this. And I think that you see that really in some hot button topics like climate change. Like there's very much a viewpoint that there's only one way to look at this. And there's such a hesitancy to undermine the premise that even somebody who might agree with the premise sort of questioning the methodology or anything like that, like, well, it sounds like you might be like trying to deny here, and so we got to shut that down, because the most important thing is to establish this as a fact, not to actually sort of like improve how we even do that. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Another example of one way to see this is the shift from in reporting, they might talk about the abortion issue as there's two sides, right? There's pro-life and there's pro-choice. Well, newsrooms that tend to lean to the left said, no, there's pro-choice and there's anti-choice, because the only way you can see this is women have a right to autonomy over their body, and that's the only acceptable way to see this. And if you disagree, then you hate women, and et cetera, and you go into like a type of ad hominem attack that I do think is a recent phenomenon. And I don't know that it's certainly exacerbated by the digital age. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that if anything, the digital age and social media is an accelerant on what you were mentioning. I would say news moving into sort of a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week business model, that probably is the starting point where you see not just the credibility issue really sort of accelerate and how it just sort of falls, but sort of the rushed content, this is almost like entertainment. It's like MTV, like you turn it on any time of the day, there's a music video for the older people in the audience. And whereas like you turn on cable news any time of the day, there's something going on. There's a new bloody lead. There's a new horrible thing happening. This is great. Gotta get more. Instead of good reporting, you just have a lot of fluff that's being thrown at you. To your point, the other issue too is the sort of, I don't know if it's modern or if this has been around for a while and I just didn't notice it, but it's sort of like moral sort of viewpoint to how to report certain stories. So a couple of years ago, there was a really fascinating ongoing debate spearheaded by the then editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News, Ben Smith, who's now with the New York Times. And he was saying, and this was before, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, Obergefell, the Supreme Court. Thank you.
Yeah.
Supreme Court ruling on legalizing gay marriage or same-sex marriage, which is now AP style, correct? He was saying there is no two sides to the story. There's one side to the story, and we've reported that way, and other newsrooms should too. And a lot of editors were like, yeah, no, you're right. There isn't two sides to same-sex marriage. There's one side, and that's how we report it. And just from a sort of clinical matter, just standing back and be like, that's a really fascinating. I don't know if I've ever heard a newsroom say something like that before. I don't know if I've ever heard an editor say outright, and then not just say it, but then to also get the full backing of all of his colleagues across the industry saying, yeah, no, there is one way to report this. Like, okay, well, what other issues would you say is true for that? And they didn't get into that. But for me, it's like, okay, well, if there's one issue that you say there's only one side to, I would be fascinated to know what other issues.
Well, and I mentioned something, their abortion, climate change. We could probably think of some more if we had a little more time, but that's where the troubling tendency comes in, right? On the same-sex marriage, if you want to call it an issue, phenomenon, social opinion on it, it's very tough, because when you think about if the BuzzFeed editor making that decision, there's only one position on this, and that's that it should be the law of the land. This should be legal. It shouldn't matter who you love. What he then is saying is anyone who adheres to thousands of years of church teaching on this, or anyone who even sees it as something to wrestle with, even if they ultimately end up agreeing, right? Maybe they have a family member and they just feel they can't, they feel like it would be disloyal to have another position on it. And really, it turns something that should be an issue of conscience into an issue of, what would you say, dogma?
To
It's
that,
like you have correct opinions or you don't, and then you start getting into, I know it sounds very alarmist, but it's reminiscent of some Orwellian themes, like what we saw in 1984.
well, to the sort of overall point that is, for me, is so fascinating is when there's one side to this issue. It's like, well, there literally isn't. They're in court. There's literally two sides. I would like to know what the other side is saying, but I'm being told that that's not important. You don't need to know what the other side's saying because only one side in this story is worth talking about. And so you hear they're like, well, so we could get into church teaching, we can get into all this other stuff, but for me, just a broader issue as just a service, as the public service of journalism, to say we will only talk about one issue because that's the right one. I was like, well, I would really like to know. Again, it's a court case. There's literally multiple parties involved.
And
What's being
shouldn't
said?
you, shouldn't you, as a member of the news media, be trying to accurately describe what the other side believes as a means of showing you understand what it is? Like, how do you even accurately debunk another side if you can't even describe what their position is because you find it so ludicrous?
Right. I don't want to have to go to Wikipedia to find out what was argued in court, because for some reason BuzzFeed News didn't want to tell me that.
But you wouldn't use Wikipedia.
I will not admit it out loud.
Anyway, sorry, we should let them know.
Okay, sorry.
Well, and that the idea of how the media deals with issues extends to human beings. So if you see an issue one way, then it would logically follow that, well, I don't like this person, so there's really no other way we can cover this person, and so we're going to go after them because we don't agree with anything that they believe in or say or do, and we're going to make them a target. I mean, regardless of who it is. I mean, whether it's Democrat or Republican. Right.
I should add, just to add on to this again, this may be much older than I realize. This may have been going on for decades, and this may actually just be normal part of everyday news journalism. The thing that struck me as fascinating about the BuzzFeed example is that's the first time I can remember someone saying it out loud, and not just saying it out loud, but then finding a lot of support afterwards from people throughout the entire industry. That's what struck me as this is particularly newsworthy right now.
There's a tradition in State of the Union addresses that was started by President Reagan, where he uses examples like people to tell the story. So he'll tell a story about, it's called Skutnik, actually. It was after a person named Skutnik who had jumped into the Potomac River and saved, here's the child, one of them saved people who were drowning after a plane crash. And he was in attendance, and President Reagan held him up as a hero. And then it was such a powerful device. So to your point about not seeing people as humans, in recent times, when you've got parties on either side of, say, the immigration issue, if you listen to the left, they would say that the immigration issue is you're not acknowledging the humanity of people who are risking their lives to try to come to America and access some of the opportunities that we're blessed with because we're born here. If you listen to the right, and you see this, the reason I mentioned the State of the Union, like you'll see you might have like a President Obama using the State of the Union First Lady box. He might have a guest there and say, and here's this immigrant who, he came here legally, but now he has a citizenship and he's so blessed because of these visas that we, whatever the policy issue is. But then on the other side here, he's trying to participate in the conversation.
He
then
can
on the
answer
other side,
too if he wants.
On the other side, you'll have an address like what President Trump used, where he had the parents of, I think, a girl who was murdered by a gang member who had come to the United States illegally. And he was using that to illustrate his belief and policy positions that we need to tighten up the border because of situations like that. So if you have a media that's reporting from one side or the other, and they're neglecting the reality of the issue, which is it's complicated, right? If you have a more lenient policy, you may have people come in and commit these terrible crimes, and then you have victims like these parents. If you have a more strict policy, you're actually preventing people coming in and blessing this country with the gifts that they have to bring, as well as ignoring, some might say like a historical, more Christian-ish mandate to care for the poor and to care about what goes on outside our own borders. And so I think there's a lost opportunity for the media on that issue as an example to really understand both sides, to present both sides, and to acknowledge the humanity that's present in both positions.
I want to remind everyone we're going to take questions, so you can have a question ready, or you can send it via the chat, and we will ask the question for you. I'm curious, can you give me your impressions of what it's like? I mean, I talk to students about this all the time, what it's like to be a Christian in media these days.
Depressing.
Uh, it's sometimes humorous because you know stuff that a lot of your colleagues just don't know. There's a general sort of illiteracy when it comes to faith. I would say, I usually say that the two issues that are just major blind spots are firearms and faith. And I have no idea why reporters just simply refuse to learn the basics of either. It's just a funny example that happened recently. Remember when I can't pronounce it, Notre Dame. That's how they say it in South Bend. How do you say it in actual France?
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame
Sorry.
burned. Yeah.
Notre Dame was burning down in France, and a chaplain ran in and saved the Eucharist. And he's speaking to a New York Times reporter and told him that he went in and saved the body of Christ. And then it made it into the New York Times reporting that the chaplain ran in and saved a little statue of Christ, because the reporter didn't understand what he meant by body of Christ. And so you just have little moments like that where you're like, huh, very large religion. And I'm kind of surprised that no editors or anyone caught that. But I'm blessed to work in a newsroom with several other Christians. And even the ones who aren't Christians have, everyone's very charitable and kind. I personally have not really had any issues myself. But you do see sort of wide throughout the industry this sort of, again, general illiteracy.
Well, it's not just illiteracy. I would say it's really interesting because I'd say a lot of people, like, I'd say the rates of depression among journalists are higher. I see people talk about that a lot, and I think that some of that might be the nature of the job. Like you really are forced to kind of stare at some of the just ugliness in the world constantly. And if you're not a Christian, you don't have that source of hope. I mean, I was joking that it's depressing. I mean, that it would be truly depressing to sorry, the other one. It would be truly depressing to be in this industry and not have the hope of Christ, and to think that this world is all that we have, and to really feel like, even if you're just, say you're kind of a person who is just, maybe you try to be a good person, right? You're not a person of faith. And you, in a sense, if you're writing every day, you're screaming into the void, and all you get back from it are nasty emails or people, perpetuating, real evil, or what you think of as evil. And I think that does have an effect on people within the industry. So I'd say, for me, I have the luxury. So journalism's not my main gig. I have a contributorship at RealClearPolitics, which is great. But, before this recent election, things just got to a place where I personally had to take a step back. Like, I got off social media. I was not as, immersed in the news cycle as my husband had to remain, because he's writing, several stories every day. And I see the toll that it takes on him. And so really it just becomes like a place that you have to bring your relationship with the Lord, and say, like, this, kind of reminding yourself and him, like, this is your responsibility. And this is like, these are really terrible things that are happening, regardless of your politics. Like, nobody's got clean hands here.
It's interesting because I was in a Bible study the other night with men. It was a men's Bible study, and a lot of these guys are convinced that the media and this new administration are out to get them. That all of these issues are an assault on our Christian values, and you can just go down the list of issues, whether it's climate change or whatever. How do you reconcile those two things, your faith with some of these issues like abortion and so on?
I think you have to go back to people. That's going to be a very Asbury friendly answer, but I mean it. Like, I'm friends with people who don't believe the same things that I do. And I would say, right after Donald Trump was elected, I was seeing a lot of newspaper accounts, a lot of media articles talking about and I saw it happening to other people, just people who used to be friends can't talk anymore, right? That didn't really happen to me. And, I was like, okay, well, I think that's positive. I think that people have to not succumb to the temptation of trying to, like, of other people, like other viewpoints, like caricaturing people who believe something different, right? So, I mean, with the recent Capitol riot, for example, I had a lot of people reaching out to me and asking me what I thought about it, because they knew that, I have said that I'm conservative, although I don't know if I'm going to use that word in the future. I mean, I'm more conservatarian. There's a libertarian streak in my politics that I think often gets neglected. Like, with news hits and media hits, they want to be like, oh, you're on the right, and here we got somebody on the left, and now we're going to talk. And I've had BBC hits where I actually agreed more with the person that was supposed to be the left person than, the point that they, I think I was frustrating to people at times because they wanted me to come on and like kind of spout like, well, here's what, Trump line. And I'm like, well, I actually don't agree with them there. But my thing has always been, I try to call balls and strikes. And you'll see that in my coverage and my analysis. But I think a lot of the time what happens is people lose themselves in the issue, and they think, oh, well, how could you possibly believe X, Y, or Z? And once you start going down that road, you do lose sight of the other person's humanity, the other side's humanity. And you forget, okay, well, sometimes people agree there's a problem, like the abortion issue. I'm pro-life. I definitely, I don't have I don't hesitate to say that, but I do also know that people on the pro-choice side have legitimate points to make about caring for a woman. Like, let's say a woman chooses not to have an abortion. Well, now she's got 18 years of paying for having this child. What support does she have? What, and Christians should care about that as well. It shouldn't stop at, let's just keep her from aborting her baby. Okay, have a nice life. Aren't you so glad you made, the right decision? So I think, trying to broaden your perspective to think about where is this other side coming from, can help to, not fall into the temptation of personalizing it and demonizing what you see as like turning it into, instead of it being a disagreement, like now it's an opponent and they're wrong and bad. Because really, oftentimes it's people trying to make right decisions. Unless, and I will say with the caveat, one thing that gets hard is when there's lying and deceit involved, then it's like, all right, well, this is not good faith attempts to solve an issue. This is just lying for political gain. And I actually can tell that is what's happening.
I wonder one more question from me, and then I'll open it up to everybody else. You had mentioned the Capitol riots. I'd be interested to hear from both of you. What did you make of the aftermath of the election? Not necessarily of the election itself, but the aftermath and the various court filings and the election was stolen theme from the Trump camp, and leading all the way up to the Capitol riots.
Do you want to go, or do you want me to?
Yeah. I thought it was embarrassing. I thought after the fifth or sixth case got thrown out, that some people would start to take the hint that this wasn't really built on solid evidence. Just watching, I can get into a sidebar, but just watching the general degradation of Rudy Giuliani from national hero to whatever he is today has just been sad. I've covered several voter fraud stories for several years. Voter fraud is real.
It is a real thing.
It's a real thing. It's a real problem. Voter ID is a real issue that we need to be discussing, et cetera, et cetera. But the claims that were being made, the numbers that would have been required, stuff about Chinese-owned companies and Hugo Chavez coming back from the grave, again, embarrassing, and just dragged out to the point where, let me put it this way, Trump lost by comparable margins in Wisconsin and Arizona as he did in Georgia. But he only obsessed about Georgia because there were 2 Senate runoff races, and he knew he could use those as leverage to get the Republican leaders to back him, because he didn't have leverage in Arizona or Wisconsin. So when we talks about, no, it's about the integrity of elections and all that, I'm like, fine, where were you in Arizona and Wisconsin? Why did you obsess over Georgia? Oh, it's because there were 2 Senate races that he knew if he leaned on those, he could try to get McConnell and other GOP leaders to kind of back him in this no hope ploy to try to convince people that millions and millions and millions of things were stolen. It's not to say there weren't irregularities. It's not to say that there wasn't fraud, but on the scale and the very specific things they were saying, again, it became embarrassing, and then, tragically culminated in a deadly riot. None of that needed to happen. All of that was 100% avoidable. And this is how I feel about it.
The conversation that Becket and I kept having about that prior to the riot, in terms of the election, fraud, again, I didn't follow it very closely because for just my own sort of peace of mind, I just was taking a step back and saying, I just don't need to be immersed in this anymore. So I don't know how credible the particular claims were. I don't think it is at all plausible that there could have been some coordinated effort to steal the election from Trump. I think that he is, he seems to be very self-obsessed and without care for the ultimate consequences. And I think that the riot sort of showed that. And I watched the footage. I did watch the footage of Giuliani's speech and Trump's speech, where Giuliani's saying, well, we have the evidence now that the election was stolen, but it's going to take us 2 days to bring it out. And it would be a real shame if this election got certified in those 2 days. I don't see how he gets away with not being charged with inciting a riot, because it's kind of like a wink, wink. Like, it was almost sounded like a bit of a mobster type thing where like, be a real shame, wink. Oh, let's go stop the certification of the election. And, and I don't think the people who did that are evil. I mean, some of them have said like, this was the worst decision I ever made. They got caught up in the moment. The people are running into the Capitol building, so they go too. And, and there is this sense of like, well, this is the people's house. My tax dollars pay for this. And I'm very sad because a lot of these people really believe that they're doing something heroic, right? They think they're being like the original colonists who were throwing the tea into the bay. They, that poor woman who was shot and died, she had a Trump flag tied around her shoulders like a cape. So like, they really believe they were trying to save the country. And I think that kind of mitigates the othering that we might be tempted to do. And you're like, well, how could you possibly? Like, it's that same reaction that I think you have to guard against, that in a sense, it really dehumanizes people's opponents, whether it's opponents in viewpoint or policy opinions, where it's like, well, yeah, I could see if you really thought that our country was at risk of having its core, foundational principles undermined, because you really believe these people that say, oh, they're stealing the election from us, someone should do something. And then you're like, well, I'll be the one to do it.
And that's where the anger comes in for me, is that, look, I'm not going to make excuses for the people who did the rioting, but they were promised there would be forthcoming evidence. This stuff, we'll have it all. The Kraken will reveal it all soon. Just you wait, just you wait. The people who were making the promising, that's the people who I'm most angry with, because they knew better. Giuliani knew better. He's not an idiot. The president knew better. They know what they knew they were selling a crock. I mean, they already withdrew the Kraken lawsuit. I don't know if anyone's been following that.
But I am going to jump in and say, like, finish what I was saying earlier, which is that as Becket and I talked about it, I think that it's possible that enough people believed that it was that important to save the country from a second Trump presidency that they may have committed voter fraud on a small scale. I don't think there's any evidence of a coordinated effort, but if enough people make that choice, then that could happen. But that could happen on either side, and that is what is probably impossible to prove.
Right, and the number of things that were thrown out of court. It's not like they weren't.
Okay, let's let them.
It's not like they weren't given a chance to present their evidence. That's all I'm saying.
Let them ask questions.
All right, let's
Well,
stop.
let's take some questions from the crew. I know you got 2 squirmy kids, so we don't want to hold you any longer than we have to. But I want to give folks an opportunity to ask a couple of questions.
I guess there's no question.
Oh, we said it all.
I'm sure somebody must have a question.
Yeah, I have one. I'll just ask, what role do you see the media playing in kind of the split of the Conservative Party or the Republican Party and the conservative movement as there become more factions? Like, how do you see the media impacting this?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the full question.
You're just saying, like, how do you see the industry as a whole sort of, does it splinter with the groups, or how does it try to cover the groups as at least one of them starts to splinter?
Yeah, so how would you say that the media is impacting the Republican Party or the conservative movements, like, starting to split?
Well, if anything, the split in the Republican Party is probably good news for the establishment, because the sort of Trump wing that breaks off is probably going to catch the brunt of all the negative press, which leaves people like McCarthy and McConnell free to sort of operate under the radar, which is honestly, that's how I think McConnell enjoys operating in the first place. But you're going to see the sort of brunt, the anger, the sort of disgust that comes across in reporting is going to be saved for people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Green Taylor and the sort of very pro-Trump wing. You'll see that for at least 4 years. Ask me again in 2024 how the establishment will be covered when it gears up to run for president. It'll probably change a little bit since then, by then.
Here's a question from Allison. How often in your careers were you or are you assigned topics to write about that don't really interest you? And how do you get your audience interested if you're not?
I constantly have to write about things I'm not interested in. Not for as a journalist. This is actually for my day job as a writer at my firm. I think that you can find a way to be interested in just about anything. You know, I mean, it's like as you research something. I mean, one of the things. So, for example, for me, like I've had to write about pesticides. You know, on the face of it, that doesn't sound very interesting, but as it turns out, it's very fascinating to learn how important it is to farmers and to our food chain to be able to use pesticides. And then, you know, I've had to learn about the regulatory process. Well, starting out, I was like, shoot me in the head. This is so boring. But then when you actually learn, oh, okay, so the kind of, what was that Schoolhouse Rock thing I was taught in school? Like, oh, this is how law gets made. It goes through Congress, like the House and the Senate, and then it goes to the White House, and then you magically have a law. Well, there's an important step left out, which is relevant agencies have to take the text of the law, which if you've ever read a bill, it's pretty hard to understand, and they have to decide what the law actually means in practice. They do the practical part. And as they figure that out, they will multiple times give the general public the opportunity to influence how they're figuring out what the law means and making what's called a final regulation. And the public has a chance to weigh in the form of a public comment process. And fun fact, every single comment that a member of the public makes that raises a particular point, the agency has to answer in the Federal Register, which is a government publication. So that's really sort of a cool detail of the way that our government functions in terms of soliciting public input that I would not have known did I not have to write about pesticides. So and in terms of, okay, so how did you then make your audience interested? I mean, I think if you're interested in it, you'll write about it in a way that is interesting. I don't know if that's a cop-out answer, but that's my thought.
In my early career, I was asked a lot to write about stuff that just was the most boring. Business editing and reporting, writing about like gold stocks. It's a very small audience for that, and they're already excited, so you didn't have to work on getting them excited. Luckily, since transitioning to commentary, I don't really write about anything that doesn't interest me because my editors are wise enough to know that if you force someone to write a piece of commentary about something that doesn't interest them, it's not going to be any good. And so fortunately, I don't have that problem anymore. In the early days, and I suspect if anyone here who's going to be getting in,
to pay your dues.
It's cutting your teeth. You're going to have to write about stuff that you will probably find extremely boring. How do you get your audience interested in it? I mean, without sounding trite or cliched, it's just, you just have to produce really good copy. Like, just do your best, but really do your best.
Well, I would say another tip for me is like talk to somebody else about it. Like if I talk to him about something and if you have to verbally explain it, it will help you write it more easily sometimes.
And also, if you can, find a source
two more questions.
Just find a source for the story who is actually really interested in it, because they might be able to get you to understand, like, why is this actually even a thing?
Well, let me ask you one more question now. What is your best advice for graduating seniors who are jumping into media?
Network.
Read a lot and listen to your editors. I know that's two answers. But...
No, if they're trying to jump into the industry, they need a network.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, Dan, forget your editors.
So this is from Abigail Pecklow. Abigail, do you mean like trying to get into the industry, or once you're into it and doing it?
Getting into the industry. So I'm a senior going to graduate this spring. So just going into the industry,
Yeah. I mean, congrats.
Oh, okay.
Congrats on your graduation, but also, network. I mean, that's the best thing you can do. Like any former Asbury people who are in the industry. And you know what? Like you can blind reach out to people like on LinkedIn. You'd be surprised how many people are willing to have a conversation with you.
The current job I have now, it is no more difficult than me calling up the main editor and asking for an informational interview. It's as simple as that. Just call him up and said, hey, I'd like to talk, and just went into his office and talked. It was great, and I got hired. But yeah, networking, It's the old saying, it's not the grades you make, it's the hands you shake. There's a lot of truth to that.
Not the pandemic.
No, don't shake hands in the pandemic. I'm not saying that.
I
But
think we're sure about that.
okay, I'll be quiet then. But yeah, networking is a big one. If I'm a huge introvert, so I had to teach myself how to do that. But it does pay off.
All right. Well, I think we're about out of time. We're going to let you guys go. And
Well, there is one more question. Do you want us to answer this last one?
what was the one? Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I missed it. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm from Emily. Have you ever been asked to report about something or advocate for something you didn't agree with or thought was wrong?
I mean, I've written speeches for people whose views politically were diametrically opposed to my own. I wouldn't say that I thought it was wrong. It was more like political analysis that I was like, I don't think this is true, but you think it's true, or I would imagine you think this is true. And so then I just wrote the speech that way. And it was a really good exercise. In terms of something that's inherently wrong, I mean, one time I was asked to write talking points advocating for the renewable fuel standard. The corn industry wanted to force EPA to force fuel manufacturers to put the E15 grade or blend on the market when they were currently doing E10. So it was like 10% of the fuel was ethanol instead of 15%. The market would not support E15, and there were car engines that couldn't run as well with E15. So it really was kind of like a crony thing where it's like, well, we want you to force people to do 15% ethanol in fuel because then we get to sell more corn. I thought that was wrong, so I refused to do it. And if you just say like, I have a problem with this, then, they'll most likely give it to somebody else to do. But then it's like, at least you didn't have to do it.
How was that received when you said that?
Well, at that point, I was senior enough in my career that like they were like, all right, have somebody else do it. But I mean, I think if you don't feel comfortable, you can just say, look, I'm really not comfortable with this. Can somebody else handle this assignment? And as long as you're not doing that all the time, like I think that it should be all right. Now, if they say no, or it becomes more of a moral thing, like, I can't think of an example, but I mean, most of the time you should be able to ask for someone else to handle it.
I've been lucky enough to not have this happen a lot. I didn't find the thing wasn't inherently wrong, but I definitely disagreed with it. And we had a really healthy argument, and I was able to convince them through just showing them the facts. Like, this is actually the situation, and the way they wanted us to cover it was just factually wrong. So we ended up covering it the way that I recommended. Again, lucky enough to work in a place to have people who are open-minded enough like that. I don't know, like if you were to run in a situation where your editor simply won't listen to you and you find it inherently wrong, I would walk. I know that sounds like a sort of something a privileged person would say, but I'm not going to put my byline on something I find like more morally repugnant to me. And I would say that at that point, if you have an editor who would try to make you do that, they don't deserve your work anyway. So.
I would say write the piece, but find people to quote that in their quotes, they directly speak what your viewpoint is. And that goes, well, yeah, I mean, that goes back to the question of bias. Like even something that's supposed to be a straight news piece, how and who is quoted and who gets the last word and all of that placement can tell a much quieter story about what the person actually believes and how the topic is presented. So that could be another option to just quitting.
Yeah, you can do that too.
Well, Becket and Anneke, we really appreciate you joining us tonight. Maybe at a later date when things are back to normal, we'll actually have you on campus.
Sure.
That'd be great.
Thanks for having us. This has been really interesting. And if people have more questions later, feel free to email.
Yeah, you can share our info if they don't have it already.
Great, we will do that. And for everyone else, this session is recorded, so it'll be archived for a while in case you want to go look at it again or view parts of it. So again, thank you very much.
Sorry, if anyone's looking to get into the industry, like feel free to network us.
Absolutely, that'd be fantastic. Thank you guys very much, everybody, and we'll see you again next month.
Sure.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.